Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. Stephanie Bree, blah blah blah, you know me. Alright, here's the thing. Saturday was May the 4th, but it was also Free Comic Book Day, but it was also my sister's birthday, and it was also work day. I had to work on Saturday. I actually put this video on the production list to do last week, because I didn't know it was going to be Free Comic Book Day. I just thought now would be a good time to talk about comic book shops. And I got busy, so I didn't do my videos last weekend, or the second half of last week. So I decided to go ahead and do it today. Now, later, browsing the Twitter, I realized that it was Free Comic Book Day on Saturday, and I was like, oh shit, I'm going to miss Free Comic Book Day because there are no comic book shops close by. And that's when it hit me. Are comic book shops still a thing? I don't mean hobby shops. I know hobby shops are still out there. And there are hobby shops that claim to be comic book shops that still technically sell comic books. But of all the ones I've seen in the last several years, none of them were straight up comic book shops. None of them. They had a comic book section, and they very obviously catered to comic book fans, fandom. They had like statues and action figures and Funko Pops and board games and trading cards and Warhammer and all that shit. And then they also had the comic book section. And I started to realize that, like, the dedicated comic book shop that primarily only sells comic books, with maybe a rack of, like, collectibles or an end cap or something, for the extra dollar bills, probably doesn't exist anymore. Kind of like how GameStop, which is pretty much the last big video game store chain, doesn't still technically exist, but technically isn't a video game store anymore either. It's basically a nerd store that some of them still sell some video games, but they're primarily like Funko Pop and cell phone accessory stores. It's the same kind of thing. There's my cat again. Everybody say hi to Buddy. He's a little needy for attention right now. There he goes. I'm pushing you down. Get down, cat. I'm doing videos. So, I'm asking you, the audience, do you have a dedicated comic book shop in your store? In your market? City, town, whatever. Wherever you live. And when I say dedicated comic book shop, I mean like, it's comic books. Wall-to-wall comic books. Shelf after shelf after shelf. Aisle after aisle comic books. Like, their business is comic books. Even if they have, like, the end cap or the little back wall of Funko Pops or some action figures on the countertop or whatever. No, I'm talking about only sells comic books. Do they still exist? Because I don't think they do. And I don't know if they can in today's market. I just don't know if you can survive just selling comic books. And no, if 10% of your product is comic books and the rest of your product is like everything but comic books, you're not a comic book shop. Because like 10% of Barnes & Noble is comic books, but they're not a fucking comic book store either. I'm talking about a legit, at the bare minimum, 50% of your product has to be actual comic books for me to consider you a comic book store. Otherwise, you're just a general collectible store. At minimum, 50% of your inventory has to be just comic books. And I don't mean graphic novels. Yes, you can have a section of graphic novels, but you also have to sell the singles, the floppies. Otherwise, you're not a if you don't sell comic books, in my opinion, you're not a comic book store. End of story. You're not. Don't come at me. You're not. If you only sell graphic novels, you're a bookstore that sells graphic novels, or you're a toy store that sells graphic novels, or whatever your primary inventory product category is, you're that store, and you also sell graphic novels. That doesn't make you a comic book store to me. If I can't walk in to your store and browse shoeboxes full of back issues of comic books nobody's ever fucking heard of, you're not a comic book store. You're not. If you literally only sell the top 12 Marvel and DC titles and maybe like a handful of graphic novels, you're not a fucking comic book store.